the spring of 1943. A German ace, a man with 31 kills to his name, a man who has downed Spitfires over Britain, Hurricanes over France, and Soviet Yaks over the frozen steppe, is looking through his cockpit glass at something that makes him laugh out loud. Not chuckle, laugh out loud. On the radio, because what he's looking at is the most ridiculous fighter aircraft he has ever seen in 4 years of war. It's fat, it's round. It looks like someone bolted a propeller onto a flying bathtub. It's so wide, so bloated, so aggressively ugly that his wingman starts calling it a Phlegon ton, a flying barrel, and the nickname sticks instantly. The Americans have sent their best, and their best looks like a joke. Here's what that German ace didn't know. That joke was carrying 8.50 caliber machine guns, each one capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. Combined, those 8 guns could put over 100 bullets into a man-sized target every single second. Within 14 months of that moment, the Luftwaffe would lose over 5,000 fighters to this aircraft. The flying barrel wasn't a joke. It was a death sentence, and the Germans had just finished laughing. To understand why German pilots laughed, you first need to understand what was happening in the skies over Europe in early 1943. The Luftwaffe's fighter pilots were, by any honest measure, the most experienced combat aviators on the planet. Men like Erich Hartmann, Walter Nowotny, and Hans-Joachim Marseille had accumulated kill counts that seemed like typos. Marseille alone had shot down 158 Allied aircraft before his death in September 1942. 158. By contrast, most American pilots arriving in England in late 1942 had fewer than 300 hours of total flight time. Some had never fired their guns at a real target. They were stepping into a war that had already been running for 3 brutal years, against men who had been sharpened by every engagement into something close to killing machines. And then Republic Aviation handed those inexperienced American boys a fighter that weighed nearly 5 tons empty. 5 tons. The Focke-Wulf 190, Germany's best fighter, weighed less than 3. The Messerschmitt 109G weighed under 2.5. Even the British Spitfire Mk 9 came in under 4 tons fully loaded. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was, on paper, an absurdity. But here's the part the history books tend to gloss over. The man who designed it wasn't stupid. He was actually a genius. And the machine he built wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated gamble on a completely different theory of aerial warfare. His name was Alexander Kartveli. Born in Tbilisi, Georgia, not the American state, the Soviet one, he had emigrated to the United States in the 1920s and joined Republic Aviation. Kartveli had a philosophy that set him apart from every other aircraft designer of his era. He believed that the future of air combat wasn't about agility. It was about power, altitude, and the ability to survive catastrophic punishment long enough to make your guns count. In 1940, as France was collapsing and the RAF was fighting for its life over southern England, Kartveli sat down and drew the XP-47B from scratch. It was unlike anything before it. The secret was the turbo-supercharger system. Most fighters of the era used mechanical superchargers driven directly off the engine to compress thin, high-altitude air. They worked reasonably well up to about 20,000 feet. Above that, performance dropped off sharply. Kartveli used a turbo-supercharger powered by exhaust gases, combined with a massive intercooler running through the fuselage belly. The result was an aircraft that didn't just maintain performance at altitude. It got better as it climbed. At 30,000 feet, where most German fighters were already gasping, the Thunderbolt was in its element. The problem was that this system was enormous. It drove the fuselage diameter to near-comical proportions. It required ducting that wound through every available inch of the aircraft's body. And it forced engineers to fit the biggest, most powerful engine ever installed in a single-seat fighter, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial producing 2,000 horsepower at war emergency settings. 2,000 horsepower. The engine in a 1943 Spitfire produced roughly 1,650. The BMW 801 in the Focke-Wulf 190 produced about 1,700. The P-47 had them both beat, and it burned fuel so fast that Republic had to give it the biggest internal tank of any single-engine fighter in the war. The result was a machine that looked, from the outside, like a design mistake. From the inside, it was an engineering masterpiece dressed in the world's ugliest suit. The first pilots to climb into the XP-47B prototype at Republic's Farmingdale factory did so with visible skepticism. One test pilot looked at the cockpit access. You had to use footholds built into the fuselage side because the wing was so far off the ground, and said, "If I have to bail out of this thing, I'll be dead before I clear the tail." He wasn't entirely wrong about the bailout problem, but the aircraft flew, and it flew in ways that stunned everyone who saw it. Here's a fact that almost nobody talks about when they discuss the P-47. Before it killed a single German, it killed Americans. In the transition training program run at bases across the eastern United States, the Thunderbolt's first victims wore American uniforms. The aircraft's enormous torque, that 2,000 horsepower engine spinning a 13-foot, four-bladed propeller, made it murderously unforgiving on takeoff. Apply full throttle too aggressively and the nose would swing violently to the left, sometimes with enough force to ground loop the aircraft before the pilot could respond. At Bridgeport, Connecticut, where the 56th Fighter Group was working up for combat deployment, Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke kept a running tally of training accidents on a chalkboard in his office. By January 1943, the board showed 15 aircraft written off, 11 pilots dead. For more seriously injured, Zemke himself had nearly died when a Thunderbolt snap-rolled on him at low altitude during a mock combat exercise. He pulled out with less than 300 feet to spare. But Zemke, unlike some of his peers, didn't blame the aircraft. He studied it. He figured out that the P-47 had a personality, a specific, demanding personality, and that pilots who flew it on its own terms could do things with it that were genuinely extraordinary. It was not a turning fighter. Full stop. Anyone who tried to outturn a Focke-Wulf or a 109 in a Thunderbolt was going to die. The aircraft's mass made sustained horizontal turns sluggish. In a tight circle with a German fighter, you lost. Every time. But here's what it was. It was the fastest diving aircraft in any theater of the war. Its massive weight, structural strength, and high-speed control authority meant it could push into a dive at angles and speeds that would tear the wings off a German fighter or cause the controls to lock solid from compressibility effects. It was almost indestructible. The R-2800 radial engine had no liquid coolant system. A single bullet through a liquid-cooled engine typically meant death within minutes as the engine seized. A radial could lose half its cylinders and keep running, and it had those 8 guns. When Zemke finally built a tactical doctrine around these strengths, dive attacks from altitude, hit-and-run passes, never slow down, never commit to a turning fight, everything changed. The question was whether he could teach it to enough pilots before combat began. The answer, as it turned out, was just barely. The 4th and 56th Fighter Groups flew their first operational sweeps over occupied France in the spring of 1943, and the Germans wasted no time forming their opinion. Jagdgeschwader 2 and JG-26, the 2 elite Luftwaffe fighter wings that defended the Channel coast, had seen everything the Allies could throw at them. Spitfires, Hurricanes, early P-38 Lightnings. They had studied each aircraft's weaknesses with the cold, analytical focus of men whose survival depended on it. The P-47, to their eyes, had weaknesses everywhere. One JG-26 pilot, whose combat diary survived the war, wrote about his first encounter with Thunderbolts on April 15, 1943. Paraphrasing from the original German, "We watched them climbing toward us in their tight formations, heavy, slow to turn. When we dived on them, they could not respond fast enough. I fired into one from behind and it went straight down, trailing black smoke. These Americans have no idea what they are doing. This will be easy." And for a while it was. In April and May of 1943, the kill ratio favored the Germans decisively. American pilots were still trying to fly their Thunderbolts like Spitfires, slow, turning, defensive. The results were predictable. But within the wreckage of those early losses, something was happening that the Germans didn't notice. The P-47s were coming home. Not all of them, but a number that simply should not have been possible given the damage they had absorbed. On May 19, 1943, a Thunderbolt from the 78th Fighter Group landed at Duxford with a hole in its right wing large enough to put your head through, 2 cylinders shot out of its engine, and hydraulic fluid streaming from a severed line. The pilot had flown it back from the Dutch coast, over 70 miles, on what amounted to a crippled machine. A Focke-Wulf or a Messerschmitt with that damage would have been a burning crater somewhere in the North Sea. German pilots were filing combat reports about aircraft that, by all logic, should have gone down and didn't. They dismissed it as luck. It wasn't. Now let's talk about those 8 guns, because this is the part that most people still don't fully appreciate. The Browning M2.50 caliber machine gun is not a subtle weapon. It fires a projectile roughly the diameter of your thumb at 2,910 feet per second. The bullet weighs about 46 grams. The kinetic energy it carries on impact is equivalent to having a 1-ton car drop on a single square inch of surface from 100 feet. Now imagine 8 of those guns firing simultaneously. At the P-47's standard convergence setting of 300 yards, all 8 streams of fire merged into a single cone of destruction approximately 4 feet wide. Within that cone, in a 2-second burst, a pilot delivered over 200 rounds of .50 caliber fire. Against an aircraft made of aluminum, plexiglass, and fuel-soaked rubber, that was simply annihilation. German fighter pilots had faced heavy machine guns before. The RAF used .303 caliber weapons in 8-gun configurations during the Battle of Britain. But the .303 was a rifle caliber round. Effective, yes, but German pilots had learned to absorb .303 hits and keep flying. Nobody absorbed .50 caliber hits. The M2 was originally designed as an anti-aircraft and light vehicle weapon. When Republic's engineers started fitting them to the P-47, they discovered something extraordinary about the combination of 8 synchronized guns and the aircraft's enormous wing structure. The wings were over 300 square feet of total surface area, the largest of any single-engine fighter in the war. That size meant the guns could be spaced far apart, which in turn meant the convergence zone was wider than on any comparable aircraft. Where a Focke-Wulf 190's cannons had a combined burst width of roughly 18 inches at 200 meters, the Thunderbolt's convergence zone was several times that. You didn't have to be precise. You aimed at an aircraft and everything in that general neighborhood ceased to exist. But there was another factor the Germans only began to understand in the fall of 1943, the American ammunition. Republic's armorers loaded their P-47s with M8 API rounds, armor-piercing incendiary. The API round had a hardened steel core surrounded by an incendiary compound that ignited on impact. When it hit an aircraft's fuel tank, it didn't just puncture the tank, it turned it into a torch. German pilots discovered this in the worst possible way. Aircraft that flew through a P-47's burst didn't simply develop fuel leaks or engine problems. They burned, instantly, with no warning and no recovery possible. The sound the 8 guns made when they fired became notorious throughout the Luftwaffe. A distinctive, tearing roar. Not the sharp crack of cannon fire, but a sustained mechanical shriek like canvas being ripped apart by a giant. One surviving German pilot described it in a post-war memoir. Once you heard that specific sound behind you, you had perhaps 1 second to react before the bullets arrived. Most men did not react in 1 second. Most men were already dead when the noise reached them, because sound travels slower than the bullets. He had heard it 3 times. He was one of the very few who had. The moment American pilots truly figured out the Thunderbolt can be traced to a specific period, June through August of 1943. Hub Zemke's 56th Fighter Group had been drilling his energy fighting doctrine for months. Altitude was life. Speed was survival. The dive was the weapon. You climbed above the Germans, you attacked from above and behind, you converted altitude into speed, you made one pass, and you broke away downward before the Germans could respond. On June 13, 1943, Zemke led a formation of 36 Thunderbolts at 32,000 feet across the Dutch coast near IJmuiden, intercepting Focke-Wulf 190s that were attacking a withdrawal of B-17 bombers. The Germans were at 24,000 feet. The Americans had 8,000 feet of altitude advantage. What followed took less than 4 minutes. Zemke rolled his formation over and they came down at over 500 miles per hour, a speed at which German pilots, used to aircraft that became uncontrollable in steep dives, simply could not match or counter. 3 Focke-Wulfs were destroyed before the German formation could react. 2 more went down in the initial chaos. One German pilot who survived recalled later that his entire flight simply ceased to exist around him in what felt like seconds. The 56th landed without a single loss. For the first time, American pilots came back from a mission not counting their wounded and their dead, but talking about what they had done to the Germans. The news spread through every P-47 group in England within 48 hours. This was how you flew it, not as a Spitfire, as a Thunderbolt, something that fell from above and destroyed whatever it hit on the way down. Over the following weeks, as more pilots absorbed Zemke's doctrine, the kill ratios began to shift. Not dramatically, not yet, but the trend was unmistakable. German losses were climbing, American losses were falling, and something else was changing. The bombers were coming home. In the summer and fall of 1943, the 8th Air Force was conducting a strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany that was, to put it plainly, getting its crew slaughtered. The October 14th raid on the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt sent 291 B-17s deep into Germany without fighter escort. 60 bombers failed to return. 600 men. In a single afternoon. The American brass had been operating under the assumption that heavily armed bombers flying in tight defensive formations could protect themselves. Schweinfurt proved, finally and catastrophically, that they couldn't. The problem was range. The P-47, for all its qualities, had relatively limited combat radius in its early form. It could escort bombers to the German border and no further. Beyond that, the B-17s were alone, and the Luftwaffe, which had learned to position its interceptors beyond P-47 range, was waiting. The solution was drop tanks, external fuel tanks that could be jettisoned before combat, extending the P-47's range from about 175 miles to over 350. The engineering and logistics of manufacturing hundreds of thousands of reliable drop tanks, distributing them across dozens of English airfields, and integrating them into tactical flying took most of 1943 to solve. But solve it they did. And when P-47s with drop tanks began appearing over targets that German pilots had considered their own safe hunting grounds, everything changed again. JG-1, the Luftwaffe fighter wing responsible for defending northwestern Germany, had developed a comfortable routine. Their pilots would wait below the clouds, safe from American escort fighters, while their Mi-109s climbed to attack the bomber streams. It was methodical, professional, and effective. On November 3, 1943, that comfortable routine ended. A formation of P-47s from the 352nd Fighter Group, carrying new centerline drop tanks, appeared over JG-1's base at Delen in the Netherlands while German fighters were in the process of forming up for exactly this kind of mission. The Germans had perhaps 30 seconds of warning before 8 guns opened up from above. 4 Messerschmitts were destroyed on the first pass. 3 more scattered. 1 German pilot, caught in the climb at low speed with his wheels still retracting, never had a chance to react at all. The P-47s were gone before JG-1 could organize a counterattack. In his after-action report, the German wing commander wrote something that was circulated to every Luftwaffe fighter command in the West. The Americans are now reaching targets we believed were outside their range. We can no longer assume any area is safe for formation assembly or transit. The enemy's firepower remains catastrophic in brief engagements. Catastrophic. The word a professional soldier uses when he's trying not to say terrifying. History has a tendency to reduce aircraft to statistics and tactics. But there were men inside these machines. On both sides. Francis Gabi Gabreski was born in Oil City, Pennsylvania, the son of Polish immigrants. He had tried to join the Army Air Forces before Pearl Harbor and been turned down. His English was deemed inadequate. After Pearl Harbor, the standards changed. Gabreski ended up flying Spitfires with a Polish RAF squadron in England before transferring to the 56th Fighter Group and their P-47s. By the summer of 1944, Gabreski had 28 aerial victories, the highest total of any American pilot in the European theater. Every one of them fell to the 8.50s of a Thunderbolt. He described his preferred tactics simply: I'd get above them, I'd make sure they hadn't seen me, then I'd come down fast and shoot until I had to pull out. If you did it right, they never knew you were there until they were already dead. Cold words, but honest ones. That's what those 8 guns made possible. Death before awareness. Now here's the other side. Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Ossenkopf flew with JG-11 defending the German coast. He was 23 years old. He had 17 victories, all against American bombers and their escorts. He was good, very good. In September 1943, Ossenkopf was scrambled to intercept a B-17 formation with a P-47 escort. He spotted what he thought was an isolated Thunderbolt, slightly separated from its formation, and moved in from the blind spot below and behind. He had been told by veterans that the P-47 had poor visibility to the rear. They were right, but they had not accounted for the fact that the isolated Thunderbolt had a wingman position several hundred meters above, invisible against the sun. That wingman saw Ossenkopf's climb. He rolled over and came down. Ossenkopf's aircraft was hit by approximately 20 rounds of .50 caliber fire in less than a second. His engine stopped. His left wing began to separate. He barely got out before the aircraft came apart. He survived. He spent 4 months in a British hospital. He never flew in combat again. After the war, asked about his memory of that moment, Ossenkopf said, "I heard a noise I had never heard before, like cloth tearing very fast. Then my aircraft simply stopped being an aircraft. There was nothing I could do. There is nothing anyone can do against that kind of firepower. Cloth tearing. 20 rounds of .50 caliber in 1 second. And a man's aircraft simply stopped being an aircraft." By June 1944, the P-47's role was evolving. The P-51 Mustang had arrived in number sufficient to take over long-range bomber escort duties, freeing the Thunderbolt for a mission it turned out to be extraordinarily suited for ground attack. On June 6, 1944, as Allied troops hit the beaches at Normandy, P-47s flew continuous ground support missions over the beachhead and the surrounding countryside. The aircraft's combination of durability, firepower, and speed made it the ideal low-level attack platform. A P-47 coming in at 350 miles per hour at low level with 8 guns blazing covered a ground target with over 300 rounds in a single pass. Against a German column on a French road, trucks, armored vehicles, horse-drawn artillery, infantry, the effect was absolute. American pilots called it sowing the road. German soldiers called it something unprintable. The Wehrmacht's entire logistical system, the trucks, the trains, the horse-drawn supply columns that kept German divisions fighting, was being systematically reduced to wreckage by Thunderbolts. By August 1944, the German 7th Army retreating from the Falaise pocket was caught in the open and subjected to continuous air attack. When Allied ground troops finally reached the pocket, they found miles of destroyed German equipment. Horses and men and machines all reduced to the same silent wreckage, predominantly by P-47s. There is a cruel arithmetic to air power that doesn't show up in individual dogfight accounts. Germany produced excellent aircraft throughout the war. The Focke-Wulf 190D9, which entered service in late 1944, was arguably the finest piston-engine fighter Germany ever built, fast, well-armed, highly maneuverable. The Me-262 jet fighter was years ahead of anything the Allies had in the air. But Germany had a problem it could never solve. It was running out of pilots. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe was graduating fighter pilots with as little as 100 hours of flight training. 100 hours. Gabreski, in his P-47, had over 700 hours before his first combat mission. Zemke had over 1,000. The gap in experience between attacker and defender was becoming unsurvivable. The P-47 was a direct cause of this crisis. Every German pilot killed in a Thunderbolt engagement represented not just one man, but months of irreplaceable training and experience. Germany's training infrastructure could not replace experienced men fast enough. Fuel shortages caused partly by American bombing of synthetic oil facilities, missions flown and protected by P-47s, meant training sorties were being cut to levels that left new pilots genuinely unprepared for combat. The Americans, meanwhile, had the opposite problem. They had more qualified pilots than aircraft. Republic Aviation was producing P-47s at a rate that seemed impossible until you visited their Farmingdale plant and saw the assembly lines running around the clock. By the end of the war, 15,686 P-47s had been built, more than any other American fighter. 15,686. Germany built approximately 20,000 Focke-Wulf 190s of all variants across the entire war. In the same period, America built nearly as many of a single, larger, heavier, and by the war's end deadlier aircraft, and did it while simultaneously building P-51s, P-38s, B-17s, B-24s, B-29s, landing craft, tanks, and half the other war material that armed the entire Allied coalition. The Luftwaffe didn't lose because its pilots were bad. Many of its pilots were extraordinary. It lost because Germany was fighting a war of attrition against a nation whose industrial capacity it had catastrophically underestimated. and the P-47 Thunderbolt was perhaps the purest single expression of what American industrial logic could produce when given unlimited resources and a clear target. In the Pacific, where American forces were island-hopping toward Japan, the Thunderbolt found a completely different war and adapted to it with equal effectiveness. The Japanese Zero was, in many ways, the opposite of the Focke-Wulf 190. Where the German fighter was heavy-armed and focused on firepower, the Zero was built to an almost obsessive standard of lightness and maneuverability. It could outturn virtually anything that flew in 1941 and 1942. Its pilots were some of the most skilled naval aviators on Earth. But the Zero was fragile. No armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no structural redundancy. It was built to turn beautifully, and it was built assuming it would never be hit. 8.50 caliber machine guns disagreed. P-47 pilots in the Pacific quickly discovered that the Zero's legendary agility was irrelevant if you never gave it the chance to use it. The same energy-fighting tactics that worked against German aircraft worked even better here. Come from above, fire once, leave before they can respond. In the Philippines campaign, P-47s from the 5th Air Force flew thousands of sorties against Japanese ground installations, shipping, and troop concentrations. The same aircraft that had been demolishing German supply columns in France was now methodically working its way through the Japanese defensive network. The arithmetic was different. The outcome was the same. In the fall and winter of 1944, the Luftwaffe made a desperate gamble. Operation Bodenplatte, ground plate, was a mass attack launched on New Year's Day, 1945. Almost 1,000 German aircraft, scraped together from every available unit, struck Allied airfields in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands in a dawn surprise attack. The Germans destroyed nearly 300 Allied aircraft on the ground. It should have been a devastating blow. In 1943, it might have been, but by January 1945, Allied aircraft production was so vast that the losses were replaced within a week. And the Luftwaffe, in executing Bodenplatte, lost over 270 aircraft and irreplaceable experienced pilots. Men who had been hoarded like gold precisely because there were so few left. It was Germany's last major offensive air operation. The response came quickly and with overwhelming force. P-47s, now operating under almost complete air superiority, began systematically destroying what remained of the Luftwaffe on the ground. Every airfield in Western Germany was attacked. Fuel dumps, maintenance facilities, aircraft on dispersal, nothing was safe. By March 1945, German fighter resistance over the Western Front had effectively ceased. Not because Germany had surrendered, not yet, but because there was simply nothing left to resist with. The men who had laughed at the flying barrel in April 1943 were gone. Their replacements, teenagers with less than 100 hours of flying time, sent into combat in aircraft increasingly difficult to fuel, weren't laughing at anything. When analysts sat down after the war to explain how the most experienced fighter force in history had been reduced to rubble, they found the P-47 at the center of the story in ways that surprised even its strongest advocates. The final statistics were extraordinary. P-47 pilots claimed over 3,700 German aircraft destroyed in aerial combat and another 3,300 on the ground. They destroyed more than 85,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles, and nearly 70,000 trucks. The logistics of an entire army had been methodically demolished by an aircraft designed, fundamentally, as a high-altitude interceptor. Kartveli had built a dinosaur. His dinosaur had eaten everything. But the deeper lesson wasn't in the kill counts. It was in what the P-47's existence said about how America thought about war. The P-47 was never the prettiest solution. It was never the most elegant engineering. It was big, heavy, thirsty, and at medium altitude it was genuinely inferior to several German aircraft in a straight one-on-one dogfight. None of that mattered, because America never intended to fight one-on-one dogfights. America intended to build 15,000 of these aircraft and send them in formations of hundreds at a time, flown by pilots trained on an industrial scale, supported by a logistics chain that could replace every loss within days. The P-47 was a weapon designed for a war of attrition, not a war of individual brilliance. And in a war of attrition, the Germans, for all their tactical genius, all their superior training, all their hard-won experience, were always going to lose. There's a harder truth buried in here that military historians sometimes soft pedal. The German pilots who died under the guns of Thunderbolts weren't inferiors. Many of them were genuinely extraordinary aviators. They died not because they were outflown. They died because the nation that sent them to war had made strategic errors from which no amount of individual skill could save them, and because Alexander Kartveli, in a drafting room in Farmingdale, New York, had built a machine specifically engineered to exploit those errors at scale. That's what the flying barrel was. Not a joke, not an ugly mistake. A calculated industrial trap, baited with an appearance of weakness, lethal to anyone who took the bait. Back to that German ace from the opening of this video. Spring 1943, laughing at fat American fighters over the Channel Coast. He survived the war. A lot of his friends didn't. In a post-war account, he described flying in late 1944, when the skies over Germany were full of American fighters and the Luftwaffe was burning through its last reserves of fuel and pilots. He wrote, "By the end I was afraid of them in ways I had not been afraid of anything since my first combat in 1940. Not of the Mustangs, not of the Spitfires, of those heavy Americans with their 8 guns, because they did not fight like us. They did not seek the elegant kill, the perfect deflection shot, the art of the dogfight. They just pointed those wings at you and let the mathematics of 8 machine guns decide the outcome. You can outfly a pilot. You cannot outfly mathematics. You cannot outfly mathematics." That's the epitaph for the Luftwaffe's Western fighter arm. The P-47 Thunderbolt was ugly. It was heavy. It guzzled fuel. Killed its own pilots in training. German aces laughed at it in April 1943 and went home to tell their wingmen about the fat American fighters that couldn't turn, couldn't climb, and had no business being in this war. 15,686 Thunderbolts disagreed. 8 guns, 3,400 rounds, and one terrifying sound like tearing cloth. The thunder spoke, and when it was done speaking, the sky above Germany was empty and silent. If this gave you a different perspective on what actually broke the Luftwaffe, drop a comment below and tell me which part hit hardest. And if you want more stories like this, not just the famous names, but the aircraft, the tactics, the engineering decisions that actually changed the war, subscribe. Because there are 100 more stories just like this one. And every single one of them deserves to be told. See you in the next one.